wrapping up, taking stock, and moving forward. The new reality for K-12 education, a symposium that has addressed the radical challenges social distancing, remote learning, and efforts to return to school are bringing educators and administrators. I'm Nicki Bazer, and I will be the moderator for today's webinar, filling in for Jackie, hoping to fill her big shoes. And I'm joined today by two of our regular panelists, Jennifer Smith.
Hello.
And Fattore Crumley.
Hi, everybody.
We are also thrilled to have another member from our Franczek Special Education Law team, Kendra Yoch.
Good afternoon.
Jennifer, Dana, and Kendra are the main editors of our Special Education Law Insights.com blog, and Kendra is the host of our Education Law Insights podcast, and they all focus a large part of their practices on student-facing issues that we're going to be talking about today. We are also very excited to welcome today Jackie Ross, who's a staff attorney at the Loyola University of Chicago School of Law, Civitas ChildLaw Clinic. Prior to becoming an attorney, Jackie was a special education teacher, so she has dealt with these issues from a variety of vantage points. The Civitas ChildLaw Clinic represents children in a variety of settings, including education. Welcome, Jackie.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Today we will be discussing FAPE and civil rights in the COVID era, essential planning for the coming school year. We know that there have been and will continue to be many challenges for educators and administrators tasked with identifying, evaluating, and serving students with disabilities under the IDEA. So we're going to cover that. We will also discuss how to make use of the limited flexibilities available and strategies to limit the amount of compensatory education that students will need upon an eventual return to the classroom. We will also be discussing responsibilities that educators and administrators have with respect to addressing discrimination, harassment, bullying, and retaliation based on race and other protected civil rights of students. This conversation we know is essential right now as we struggle as a nation in the wake of the horrific deaths of Mr. Arbery, Ms. Taylor, and Mr. Floyd, and countless other Black Americans. We know that our school buildings need to be places where students feel safe and supported, and where students and staff can have real and honest conversations about the injustices in the world and also within our school buildings. I do want to highlight before we begin that although this is the last of our symposium webinars and the 13th of our weekly webinars since we began doing them in March, we're not going anywhere, and we have some extremely exciting programming planned in the coming weeks. We next week, Thursday, June 18th, we'll be having a superintendent's roundtable on COVID issues related to return to school in the fall. Three of our regular panelists, Jennifer, Dana, and Shelley Anderson, will be on the panel, but we're also thrilled that they will be joined by Dr. Melissa Kiskowski of Glen Ellen School District 41, Dr. Joylyn Pruitt-Adams of Oak Park River Forest High School District, and Dr. Susan Zola of Campaign Unit District 4 on the panel to provide the superintendent's perspective. And we'll be working hard to cover all of the basis from elementary to high school, to unit districts, to suburban, to urban, to Chicagoland, and downstate perspectives. So keep an eye out for an email to register for that. And as always, if you find yourself looking for more information or if we're not able to get to your questions today, please reach out to any one of us for information. If you've missed any of our symposium webinars, you can find them on our website at franczek.com. And you can also find out more information about our other webinars, alerts, blogs, and podcasts. So we are going to start with our questions. I want to start with the issues that have been raised with what we were talking about earlier, the deaths of Mr. Floyd and other Black Americans, and obviously the national and international now discussion on race and racism. What are your thoughts, Jennifer, on areas where school districts can proactively make reforms that address these issues that have been raised by Mr. Floyd's death and the death of so many others?
So one issue that there's been a lot of discussion, obviously, is around law enforcement and relationships with law enforcement. This is an area where Illinois law recently changed, and we only recently went into COVID mode following the implementation of a law change that really required districts to change practices when law enforcement's involved in questioning or detaining students. So I think that law and that change in the law is a really good jumping off point to relook at your practices and the way you coordinate with law enforcement, how you let law enforcement interact with your students, what processes you have in place, what protections you have in place. That law change really gives you a reason, if you didn't already need, if one wasn't already needed, but it gives a framework for what changes should be made if you hadn't already made those as the law changed in January. So that would be one place. And I know, Kendra, I know you guys have some other thoughts.
Yeah, I think something else to think about is with SB 100. I know when that first came out, everybody was sort of in panic mode and maybe didn't get to some of the things that weren't required, like the optional training that was recommended. And that training, it's not just for your deans, it's for teachers, it's for school board members, it's for SROs. You're encouraged to do training really across the board about things like the adverse consequences of out-of-school discipline and justice system involvement, disciplinary methods that promote a positive and healthy school climate, really thinking about sort of that restorative justice model, training for everybody to sort of shift that perspective from a disciplinary consequence and punishment to how are we teaching skills, how are we building a positive climate that can be more inclusive of all students.
Jackie, I know that there's been some issues that you have heard about that have been raised within school with students related to issues of race. Can you share those a little bit with us and your thoughts on those?
Sure. I've seen students frustrated when maybe their teacher isn't from the community that they're from, and they feel like teachers are being a little insensitive to think that this isn't impacting their productivity, their engagement, their well-being. And I think that students are just wanting it to be a point of discussion and just recognizing that the world outside is creeping into their home lives is very, very important and will do a lot. I also see that a lot of times if a student is going to a school where maybe he is in the minority, that student might have experienced race-based discrimination. And I think a lot of times teachers, their first instinct is to stop that behavior. But I think that there's a greater responsibility for the school to take proactive measures to mitigate that hostile environment. And so it's not just responding in the moment. I think it's going to be very important to give teachers professional development around having productive conversations about race, about the civil unrest.
Great, thank you. And I know that we have been hearing, obviously everybody is struggling right now with the return to instruction. Dana, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about any civil rights and equity concerns with some of the ideas that have come up about bringing some students back over others. So students with special needs, homeless students, other students in more vulnerable populations. Dana, I don't know if you want to start. You're on mute.
Sure.
I think Dana is having some computer issues. I'm happy to.
I'm sorry, I'm having computer issues here.
Dana, I'm happy to join in. I know why you're kind of resolving that.
Thanks, Jennifer.
So, yeah, one thing is that I heard there is a lot of discussion about when you're doing assignment of students, do their circumstance need to play a role in that calculation? So for example, if we're bringing everyone back half-time, that would be one way to assign it. Everyone gets exactly equal. There's another perspective that's being advocated where you look at the circumstance, and maybe for those who can succeed on remote learning, they need to continue to do so to make room for students who cannot, based on their circumstance and individual needs. So more of a equity, you get what you need as opposed to everyone gets the same. One person that I've heard speak on that is Arnie Duncan, and I would say I heard him interviewed on a podcast last week, the Andy Slavitt podcast. So that would be one place to hear that perspective. I will say I have not heard I've heard it out there as a concept. I have not heard a lot of districts going in that direction, but it's certainly something that is out there being advocated for, and maybe there's less extreme versions. So if some families are not voluntarily on remote learning, you're going to see dramatic pushback. I don't know how, when I listened to that interview with Arnie, I thought, whoa, that is actually very radical. And in my, I was just, I don't know how that would be accepted, but there might be around the edges. I mean, can you give extra support without, you know, raising the same kind of community outrage? I think that could be done. It could be done incrementally rather than you all have to stay home because you're advantaged and we're going to have all the disadvantaged students attend in person. I don't know that that would be accepted.
Yeah, I mean, I think one other consideration is for your kids who are in self-contained classes that are already small, you know, is there an opportunity to get them in the building more because, you know, it is already a smaller class. There's less of a need to have part of the kids out and part of the kids in. And I think to the extent that the private therapeutic schools are able to start opening up more because just by design, they're small and have some of these things in place, you know, to the extent districts are not providing those special ed services in the school building, we may see a big push from parents saying, my kid needs a therapeutic day school because remote learning is just not working for them. And this is the only way I can get back into the school building.
Yeah, I would just add that, you know, I think that what is equitable doesn't mean what is the same. And we see a lot of data around, you know, students in temporary living situations are having the hardest time engaging in this remote learning. The next group being special ed students, the next group being students with limited English proficiency. So I do think the equitable thing would be to kind of target those students coming back or prioritizing them coming back in person. But I don't think it's going to be a blanket, you know, all kids with IEPs come back, because I do have a fair number of clients, particularly ones with emotional disabilities or ones who have been teased and bullied in school, who are doing phenomenally right now. And who, you know, have been more productive in this time period than they have been in the past. So I think it's, you know, I think kind of surveying teachers of who seems to be struggling with this engagement, who's doing well, and then parents as well will be important.
Great. We're talking about a lot of equity issues today and civil rights issues. Jackie, I know you represent obviously families, primarily students with special education needs. What have you seen over the spring that were the biggest struggles for your families and for your students that districts should consider when planning for the fall?
I've seen that our students who are in therapeutic day schools and students who are in the self-contained setting for the majority of the day are doing much better than our students who are in the co-taught setting or receive some pull-out support. So we've seen a lot of our students with IEPs basically being treated as general education students, where kind of dropping into office hours is the only support that they're getting. Or that, you know, schools will point to a student not showing up to office hours as a way to rationalize, like, not offering more services. And I don't think that the law supports that stance. We've also seen, and I recognize how hard it is for schools to try to motivate families to stay engaged without coming across as punitive, but I think that a lot of districts will try to motivate families, but what ends up happening is it pushes them over the edge. So, you know, they'll say, if you don't start doing more work, you're going to get an incomplete. You might have to do summer school. You might have to repeat the grade in the fall. And so instead of piling more onto families, I wish that teams were more collaborative, flexible, and kind of said to the family, what is it that's stopping you all from being able to engage in this time, and what can we do to support you?
Great. And Jackie, have you seen any specific concerns with your families who have parents who are not native English speakers?
Yes, absolutely. So, I think at this time there's been this huge need for, the parents are acting as case managers, paraprofessionals, special education teachers, and they need a lot of support from the school team as a result. And they'll need some IT support too if they're not able to get the Zoom to work or the Google Hangouts or whatever. And I have seen those families with limited English proficiency not being able to access those supports at the same level as English speaking families. So that's definitely a concern.
So can you give us some thoughts on how to make those issues a little bit easier for families to navigate as districts start planning? We have obviously a lot of complex planning to do in the fall. What would your recommendations be in terms of making things easier and more accessible for families?
I think the most practical thing would be considering, is this case manager a Spanish speaking case manager or is it not? And if they're not, if there's that disconnect between the language that the family speaks and the main point of contact for the school, then changing who that person is could be a really easy solution. Having an IT person available who speaks like very common languages that aren't English, I think could be a huge help. And making sure that any like important parent guidances that go out are available in common languages as well.
More generally, are there things that that your families are looking for from districts? If we are continuing with remote learning in the fall, how can it be better for them?
Yeah, I think that a lot of families, there's obviously like the device issue. A lot of families don't have devices. A lot of families don't have internet or high-speed internet. Quiet space has been a huge issue for a lot of our families. Siblings having to share the same device. Or, one sibling has office hours from 9 to 10, while the other sibling has office hours at the exact same time. So I think that figuring these things out internally as a school and then presenting a plan to the family, but allowing for that family voice is very, very important and could smooth a lot of these issues over.
Right.
Yeah, it seems like communication is just so critical here, and the needs of different kids and families are going to be different, and how easily they interact with technology and kind of what contact points they're comfortable with. It just is going to require a lot of communication and individualization, not just for special ed kids, but really across the board.
And this really brings up where I think we're seeing some districts that are being proactive do some training. So when we went out so suddenly with no staff training, there was really no directives or structures around what teachers could use as far as, apps or structure or communication. It was like, just everyone do your best. And I am seeing, and I hope that it translates, Jackie, your clients are ultimately going to see districts are starting to streamline and say, okay, we need a more organized, uniform platform, communication plan for office hours, or way to interact with students that works better. So I think there were those kinds of lessons learned, and completely agree that point about the having communication in the language of the parent. I think just in the rush of being done with no professional development, no directives, just everyone doing their best, hopefully these are the kind of issues we can start to address over the summer as we plan for fall, should remote learning continue.
One of the things that I know that we've been hearing about is the idea of using paraprofessional support during remote learning in particular to ease some of these issues. Jackie, I don't know, have you any thoughts about that, seen any use of paraprofessionals that you thought were particularly helpful?
Yes. So I've seen paraprofessionals use the chat feature during a whole class lesson, and that's been successful. For kids who, are struggling with that remote learning, paras have just been calling, having FaceTime with them, texting to check in. I think that can be really, really helpful, because I think that students are feeling that schools are looking to get things out of them, get a work product, and they're forgetting that emotional connection piece that's so important for a lot of our students. So I think that they can be really, really helpful that way.
Great. And Kendra,
I also think, sorry, kind of acting as mini case managers in terms of okay, you have a D in this grade, this class, you have a B in this class. So maybe, if you have a limited amount of time, let's prioritize that class with the D. What do we need to get you, in a better place?
Right. And I think one of the concerns for school districts is how can we use these paraprofessionals? What is permissible? What is a permissible use of a paraprofessional, and how much can they be interacting with students? But I do see this as a huge emerging need, just because we need to have more personal connections with more kids, and especially managing workloads, checking in with families, really listing out those duties that paraprofessionals can do without direct teacher oversight, and having them participate more in class. Your clients telling you that it works to have paraprofessionals in the chat feature. I mean, I think we just have to use all the things that we have and really try to use them to the maximum that we can.
And this is
welcome back, Dana.
Yes, I'm hoping that I'm not going to have any more computer issues, which are, a plague of these times that we're in.
That is so true. So on the paraprofessional issue, I mean, we're not talking about, there gets to be concern sometimes, well, that's going to encroach on the teacher, what's really a teacher responsibility. But I would think of it in terms of, is the paraprofessional, are they planning the actual instruction? Are they actually the evaluator of the student and the content? As long as those two things aren't true, they're really facilitating those or at the direction of the teacher, those would be legally permissible uses. So everything that Jackie said, everything that Dana said, I don't think we're going to get into a legal issue where it's a prohibited, anything in the accommodation section, for example, of an IEP, those are often supported by paraprofessionals. They're not designing their instruction, they're supporting it.
Yeah, and I've heard a lot of students kind of voice frustration that they're in the moment, they're doing their work, they'll email a teacher asking for help, and then the teacher's living their life, they have to provide childcare to their own children, whatever, and maybe it's 18 hours until that teacher gets back to the student, and then the student isn't in that headspace and can't take it in. So maybe using breakout rooms for independent practice time, having the paraprofessional in that breakout room with the student, and the teacher still has the option of popping into a breakout room if they're using Zoom, for example.
Great. And
I think having those things where a teacher or an administrator can pop in to whatever the paraprofessional is doing can help alleviate some of the concerns people may have related to safety and supervision. There are some safeguards you can put in place to manage that.
great. And shifting to our return to the fall, assuming that we are able to at least do some in person or there's at least a blended. Jackie, you talked a bit before about just sort of the emotional some of the concerns that students had with remote learning, some of the impact. What do you think, what kinds of additional services do you think districts may have to implement to address student needs, particularly student needs that have arisen over this remote time when and if we return in the fall?
Yeah, I think that a lot of our students are just under this cloud of trauma. Trauma is not being able to control the circumstances that are around you, right? And so just being aware, using more trauma-informed teaching, and understanding that they're not going to be in a space where learning can take root if that is not more regulated, if they're not more supported in that area. So I hope that school districts and the state can give teachers the flexibility to give students that space to work on the social emotional piece, not just related to COVID and the fact that we know that, you know, communities of color are having more people, you know, die from this, but they're also being more impacted in the job loss. And then, you know, I have families who are being very impacted by the looting that occurred. I have families who now are having to travel an hour away to be able to get, you know, protein. So I just think that recognizing how much stress a lot of our families are under is going to be so important, and coming from a place of empathy.
That's great, Dana. I want to talk a little bit about how if Dana can hear us, and maybe Jennifer will jump in if not, how much work that this will require over the summer and how we should be thinking about that work. But I do want to just pause because we didn't say it at the beginning. We're so fortunate to have Jackie here, but if you have questions for her or any one of our panel members, please use the Q&A function. I know a lot of you have been on our webinars for the full 13 weeks and know this, but if you post a question in the Q&A, we'll stop it a little bit from our discussion and address your questions. So please do submit questions as you have them. So again, turning back, Jackie made a lot of points about sort of the emotional needs that students have, sort of the panoply of issues that they're facing, and what districts really need to implement. What does that look like in terms of summer planning? And I'm going to let Jen sort of take this to begin with. It looks like Dana's still struggling a little bit with her computer.
Sure. Well, one issue that I know some districts are struggling is risk assessments, and we are seeing a spike in social emotional needs, severe social emotional needs. So planning for how does that look remotely, or when we finally do, let's say school does resume, you know, how are you going to how are you going to make your staff available? I'm really concerned that our key staff for supporting social emotional needs are also going to be the key staff that's overwhelmed with, for example, case study evaluations that we weren't able to finish over the summer. So you're going to have your social workers and your psychologists who are going to be doing risk assessments, evaluations, you know, they're the leaders in your school in social emotional learning. So to the extent we can support them with other with teachers, with administrators, and spread some of those responsibilities. I think those kind of logistics need to be planned, possibly bringing in some extra staff, even though it wasn't planned for, to finish up evaluations in the summer. We're going to talk about that. That's probably required anyways now that the requirements are lifted as far as doing those face-to-face evaluations. So those are a couple key things. Dana, are you able to join? Not yet, maybe.
Not yet. Give me one more minute.
Yeah, so
I'm trying the backup, which you guys will know what that is, the backup box.
Yes.
So one of the things we had talked about when we were preparing is just there's a lot that needs to go into this to get ready for the fall. You know, training teachers to be able to provide some of that social emotional support. What does that curriculum look like? Training teachers for you know, looping back and catching some of the material that may have been missed in the spring that, you know, might not be part of the normal curriculum they need. There's just a lot of training and planning that's necessary over the summer. And, you know, that takes funds to get teachers back in the door over the summer. That's, you know, not part of their regular school year. And I think, you know, with the economy the way it is and budgets the way they are, that is a huge problem, and it is a conflict that, you know, we need more and more resources for more social workers, more psychologists, more support for kids, and there's going to be less and less money to do it. And so, you know, I've seen efforts pushing for, you know, the state and especially federal to provide more funding in this area, but we're going to hit a conflict where there's just not enough resources to do that planning and provide those supports without some extra help.
Yeah, I would just add that I think that districts should understand that by working on this up front, by prioritizing special education teachers having that FaceTime with their special education students, making sure that related service providers are providing some level of comparable service. It's worth it for them in the end, because if they, don't get, if they're not starting to do this, there's going to be more requests for therapeutic day school placements, which are obviously much more expensive. And because of the nature of the small size of the programs, those placements have been able to pivot very much quicker. And so I'll see families where they have one student who's attending the neighborhood school and one student who's attending the therapeutic day school, and the discrepancy in the services that they're being provided when both have IEPs is, very frustrating to that parent. So it's worth it for the district to, get on top of this over the summer.
Yeah, I think we're almost getting the flip. Normally, a lot of parents want students to come back from therapeutic day schools, but I've heard the same feedback. Parents that were before pushing, and we even had meetings scheduled to bring them back, they said, no, we're fine. we want to stay at the therapeutic day. So I agree. I mean, from the school district side, we're getting that same feedback from parents that we work with.
Mm-hmm.
Jackie, you've raised a number of concerns, and we've obviously just discussed the funding issues that sort of come hand in hand with those. Is Loyola doing any work at the state level to address these concerns regarding the issues that families are facing and the funding levels?
So we signed on to a letter and added some recommendations to a letter to ISB and Governor Pritzker. It was organized by the Peer Coalition, Raise Your Hand, and the Chicago Lawyers Committee around the need for equity, transparency, and community input in the use of funding from the CARES Act. And then kind of the thing that I'm going to be focused on this summer in terms of more policy is I think that it's, we're going to see a huge influx of students who have to do summer school remotely. And I don't think that that's going to go any better than it went this spring, unless there are a lot of changes that are done very quickly. And so then I think there's a very real risk that our under-resourced students are going to be the ones that, are at risk for being retained next year, or have to retake a lot of classes. And so I see that as very problematic. And I think there's going to be a lot of work around that. I saw the Noble Charter School Network made a decision about a month ago, and this was even before all of everything related to George Floyd's death, that they were going to allow all of their students to be promoted to the next grade. To me, that seems like an equitable solution. Students, there's a lot of flexibility, and students get temporary grades right now, is my understanding, and they're going to get to continue to work on those in the fall if they would like. But I think because there's a chance that we'll have more in-person instruction in the fall, to me, that seems like a good solution.
So that is an area where, we can talk about if students had incompletes, let's say in the spring, and we understand advocates and counsel like Jackie will be out there representing parents, and this is a major area of concern. This is an area where we would counsel schools to really look at what can you do to get that student credit and support that student. It really, on the district end, it isn't great evidence. If we have students that are not getting passing grades, especially your IEP students, if it requires them to extend past their fourth year when they wouldn't have otherwise, if we get a due process from that family, the fact that they weren't able to complete the course, then we're going to get into some issues of, well, what support was provided? Was the IEP implemented? Was there an amendment if services weren't provided? What was the parent feedback there? What was the progress report? What was the data collection? All that whole can of worms gets opened with these incompletes. I really think if we start having conflicts over them. So it's an issue where this summer needs to be proactive. Get those kids the services and the passing grades, really.
Right, and I do think that retention is not the answer. Retention is not the answer from a student perspective. And it's not the answer from a systems perspective. We just can't afford to keep a whole entire group of students back and repeat something. We need to, it's not only better for them, which it's so much better for them. And I think the research has borne that out, even in situations where we don't have a global pandemic and kids are being retained for other reasons that might just be affecting them personally. We can't sustain that sort of model where we have kids repeating. And I think that with the right supports in place and with the right teacher collaboration between grades across and teachers in specific subject matters, you can address the discrepancies that you're going to find when kids return. And again, I go back to what Jennifer said, you're putting yourself in a very precarious legal position if you have a special ed student that earned nothing but incompletes.
We're not in a world where you have to, we individualize for IEP students all the time. I mean, that's the whole point of an IEP, actually. So the fact that they didn't demonstrate knowledge of 10th grade math or whatever, that should not be a problem for an IEP student, because we can, even more than other students, we can individualize that and they can carry on to 11th grade and we can work on whatever deficit areas there were. Obviously, even for general education students, this is going to be an issue. And where they didn't already have an IEP, I mean, we're getting, I know of districts that are even still getting case study requests this summer because remote learning didn't go well from the parent's perspective. So, I mean, being generous in a way on these grading, or being empathetic to the situation that families are in and reflecting the grades is in everyone's best interests, I think, right now.
I think creative is also a good way to go, because, certainly a class isn't just 20 homework assignments. There are big picture things, projects, experiential things that kids can do that don't require them, that don't require the kind of attention over a period of days that maybe regular homework does.
Yeah, I think saying to the student, how do you want to show what we're looking for? If the student has a specific learning disability in writing, like maybe instead they get to draw, if that's something that's therapeutic and enjoyable to them. So being very flexible, and also, like Dana said, like being, I think like backwards design right now is super important. Thinking like, what do I want my student to know in the end? And what are those, activities that are aligned to that learning outcome, rather than, 20 assignments of busy work that are just going to push that family off the edge. I've had a client that had to have her child hospitalized because she couldn't motivate the kid to do what I would say was busy work. And like, what a shame,
So as we continue to think about the fall, we're still obviously in this middle ground of some of it we think is going to be remote, some likely in person. We're not really sure. So I think thinking through some of the lessons learned, and Dana, could you talk a little bit about accommodations and assistive technology? What were the major issues that you are seeing with respect to requests in the virtual realm, and what do we see that might continue into the fall if we are remote?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a few things in the virtual realm that we've learned from special ed cases in these past few months. And I think, making sure that we're using the technology to its greatest potential. So I do think we've had a lot of requests to record. I know that sometimes teachers are very hesitant to have their lesson recorded, but, kids do record the audio part when we're in class normally, and I think we need to look at ways that we can have audio recordings of lessons, have things, supplementary materials, and really it's really using technology to differentiate and making sure that we get those accommodations to the kids that need them and train staff on how to use them. I think those are the main things that I've thought about. What about Kendra and Jen? Can you think of anything else that clients have shared?
I mean, I think one other thing is looping it back to what you're saying about being creative, right? If the typical assignment was going to be to read this chapter and answer these questions, and that, you know, in a remote situation is going to be really hard for a student, you know, that accommodation can be changing how that student demonstrates understanding. And so, you know, do they have at home the capability to have the text to speech to read that chapter? You know, how else other than answering questions can they demonstrate that they understood it? You know, is it the student recording themselves on a video, doing something and then sending it to the teacher? You know, how else can we use technology to kind of redesign that expectation more holistically?
Yeah, what about IEP meetings? You know, what are you guys seeing in terms, Dana, maybe start with you. Parents are reluctant or unable to participate via Zoom or Google Meet. Maybe they have technology issues. Are schools coming up with creative solutions now that some in-person meetings are permitted? Obviously, we're in phase 3 right now. We can have 10 people or less in a room. What are you seeing in terms of remote IEP meetings versus in-person?
So I think there are some people that are very hesitant to do the remote IEP meetings. I don't know if it's because their access to technology or they don't have a quiet private space in where they live to do it, and they don't feel comfortable engaging in this sort of discussion you would engage in an IEP meeting. So, I mean, I think now that the buildings are open up to some extent, and we have, you know, definitely all the clients I've talked to have essential staff in, and they have some other staff coming in, and we have our safety precautions set up in terms of screening small numbers of people. I had one client set up a classroom for 2 parents, and they came in and they were screened before they came in, and they were taken to a classroom where they were by themselves, and then there was technology set up for them. So the meeting was remote, but in the same building, kind of when we're too lazy to get up out of our office desks, and we used to email each other, and now if we had the opportunity, we definitely walk down the hall. But they just did a remote meeting sort of in the same location, and it worked very well. The technology, they didn't have the issues that I had earlier today, because they were all right there, and it was the district internet connection, and everything was great. So again, that required a little creativity, but it allows people to come in and participate.
Yeah, I had a mediation yesterday, and the school staff actually went to the building, and there were 2 people, and they sat on opposite sides of a classroom, but that allowed them to be able to have a little bit more natural communication, at least, you know, while we were caucusing, and everybody else was still virtual. But as you're able to get even just 1 or 2 people in, or if they really need to be in the building for technology or access to certain records, having that additional option, I think, can help facilitate these meetings too.
Great. We did have a question come in. Jennifer, if the question was, what if you ask for more assistance for your child? So as a parent during the summer, but the school refuses. This person who's asking the question said it will hinder rather than help to do summer school. What are your thoughts on that?
So we still do have our structures of how we support students, and for summer, that, you know, how we have staff available is through either extended school year or summer school, and those are the supports. So if a district offers that, I think it was some of the communication early on was sort of over promising as far as what summer might look like, especially when I think we all naively thought maybe summer could be in person, and there was a lot of discussion about catch up over the summer. Once we found out that summer was basically going to be remote, and even now that in-person is allowed, there was no time to prepare for that. So basically what you're looking at in summer is some remote support. So representing the district, I mean, I would say what we have available is our summer offerings, whether it's ESY or summer school, and hopefully that would be a support. Otherwise, realistically, we don't have, even though there was a lot of discussion about providing support during the summer, that's not the way districts are staffed. So I think we need to change parents' expectations around that and look for planning in the fall. How do we make the transition to fall successful, depending on what the issue was? So if it's a technology issue, can we troubleshoot that before fall? if it was getting feedback on what instruction did not work, if it's providing enrichment resources, but obviously other than summer school, we're not going to have direct student services. I don't know, Jackie, if there's other kinds of requests that your families are making or that you're hearing districts are providing, but I really am concerned that sort of we set up summer to be a remedy that we did not staff, or actually that was unrealistic in given our situation.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think summer school is going to be the cure that a lot of people think it could be. I don't think it's a real solution. And I see a lot of families who are under so much pressure right now, like opting out of ESY, even though in the past they've opted in, because they're just like, please let this be over. So yeah, it's all over the place.
Yeah, having shepherded one child through sixth grade, the end of sixth grade, I'm just done at this point. Fourth grade was easier. Okay, Dana, we got a great question. One of the things, one of the questions was, have you seen districts exploring more concepts relating to UDL or universal design for learning in terms of how students are taught, demonstrate knowledge, and are graded? Obviously, we know that these universal design assists students with disabilities. It also assists everyone. So have you seen any of those discussions taking place?
So I think this is, I see a lot of creative things going on in school districts right now in response to this. And I think universal design has always been something that districts are attracted to, utilizing that more in their development of curriculum, because it allows for differentiation on both ends of the spectrum. It allows you to really capture the students that might be gifted in a particular area, and it allows you to bring up and to be inclusive of kids that are struggling in a particular area, all in sort of one setting. And it is, in a way, it's kind of like real world, right? Because we all have a role to play, and if you look at an organization, there are people that are doing different parts of a task, of a group project, and I think that's why it brings a lot of value too. But I think other things like block scheduling is something that we're seeing, because people are thinking about whether, if I have to have part remote and part, or if I have to have smaller class groups, how am I going to facilitate that if I'm going to be in and out of the building? And looking at classes meeting every other day, it's sort of easier to transition into remote learning. If you look at the higher ed setting, anyone that has a college student at home, they kind of just do this. It's 3 times a week lecture, it's a schedule here, and it transitions a little bit, it's a more manageable. So all of these different curricular programs, interventions, methodologies, I think people are using everything in the toolbox right now.
Great. And Jackie, another question we got in, if we're back, in person, face-to-face next year, but ISB still recommends that IEP meetings be held remotely, do you see issues that we can prevent with the school staff being present together in person, but mandating parents participate remotely?
Yeah, I was surprised at how well our IEP meetings went through Google Zoom, or Zoom or Google Hangouts. I think that I heard from a lot of parents, I wish these could continue forever. It just felt more collaborative. It may be because we're all under this stress. Everyone was just being kinder, more human to each other. I don't know. But then I did have an IEP meeting where a couple of staff were together and then everybody else was separate. And there was talk amongst those few staff that were together, and it wasn't a positive contribution. So I think you have to be very, very cautious of alienating the parent. I was listening to this podcast the other day on trauma-informed teaching, and it said, I love this, it said, trust is the antidote to stress. So I think anything you can do right now to develop trust and safeguard against, that fostering lack of trust, I would encourage schools to do that. So yeah.
Great. I know we have some other questions coming in, and I will get to those. And I think we have a couple questions in the chat. So if you can move them to the Q&A, that'd be great, or else we'll try to catch those too. But I know we had mentioned earlier talking about evaluation. So I know we want to touch on that before we close. Jennifer, we've been struggling with the questions related to evaluations, getting them done during remote learning. With the new guidance from ISB, has our advice changed on that?
Yes, I think the new guidance really puts districts in a bit of a bind, frankly, because the only reason, there were some category of evaluations where we couldn't complete them because a component had to be done face-to-face, and we were relying on ISB's prior guidance saying that if a face-to-face component is required, wait till face-to-face can resume in order to complete that evaluation. So those had been kind of put on hold, and we assumed till fall. That's the way that I think many read that guidance. Then the guidance came out, I don't know if it was last week, the days are all running together now, but the recent guidance came out that said face-to-face can resume, including those in-person assessments. The difficulty with that is if we already have consent signed before the end of the school year, so I'm not talking about requests that are coming in during the summer, but where consent was signed before the end of the school year, they're technically due before the start of the upcoming school year. Now, there's a lot in flux. We don't even know necessarily when the start of the upcoming school year will be, but that is leaving many districts to scramble because we had not staffed for that. So staff are gone. We don't have just teams available to do a huge number of evaluations. So obviously the legally compliant answer is we have to get them done this summer. Now, I will say, in the course of my career, some of the worst cases that I've had were following summer evaluations, because you have teams that are not they don't know the student. So we're going to be lucky if we can get anyone to complete these evaluations, and the people we get probably won't know the student. It'll just be really lucky if they happen to also know the student or have had the student in class. That is a recipe for absolute disaster when it comes, because then it kind of poisons the whole process. If the evaluation isn't good, and these are initial and they're going to be contested, and not to sound too doom and gloom, so to comply with, I think we are in a situation now, you have to finish the evaluation over the summer if you're going to meet the timeline. If we don't, there's some liability exposure there because we didn't meet the timeline. But I guess what I'm also saying is if you don't staff those teams and get good evaluations done this summer, which is really hard, there's going to be liability is going to flow for the next several years as we're relying on those evaluations, or someday we might have to defend those evaluations.
Yeah, and I see kind of two other concerns. One is just really the need to talk with the family about, are you going to get good, accurate, reliable data if you evaluate the student now? Is the student mentally in a place where they can take an assessment and you're going to get a valid and accurate result, or because of all of the other things happening, are you just not going to get good data? And so does it make sense to do that evaluation now? I think on the other hand, if parents really, really want that evaluation and the school is saying, no, we can't do it, or we don't think it's appropriate, to the extent the independent evaluators are back up and running, you're going to have a bunch of parents going out and getting independent evaluations done and then asking for the district to fund it. So there's sort of some competing considerations there.
So moving back to some of our questions that have come in, Dana, again, moving to this idea that hopefully we will be back in person in the fall, can you talk about how to address medically complex students with IEPs whose parents want them to return, and the school is concerned about their health? I love this part about students who cannot control their sneezes. So who sneeze on, I don't know a student who doesn't just sneeze on everybody. So, but I think they
cover our sneezes, but I don't think anyone can control their sneezes.
No,
that's a human impossibility. We can sneeze into our elbow, we can sneeze into a tissue, but
right, I think that's what the question is. But I mean, it's a serious question, which is you have medically
It's a very serious question, and I think you go back to how you do this normally. We do have this extra layer of COVID-19, but you need to communicate with the student's healthcare team. Whenever you have a medically fragile student, it is so important to not only communicate with the parent, but get the proper consent signed so that you can communicate with the healthcare providers directly, and you can have that direct communication between the person that knows the building very well and the setting very well and the other kids, and the person that knows the medical condition very well and the recommendations and the guidance and the precautions. I find that sometimes you'll have these situations where the parent does not want to give you consent to talk to the medical provider directly. And that is not a good situation to be in. And not because of any ill intent. And I think you have to stress to parent, this is not because we want to go behind your back. This is because we want to provide the plan that is the best it can be. And that's when if you have too many middlemen, it's like the telephone game. Imagine like giving, specific instructions about health care issues, and it has to go through 3 people. Not a good idea. That's not how they would do it if someone was hospitalized, and that's not how we should do it in the school setting. So getting those consents and then working with the physician, it may be possible, it may be not. You might be giving remote learning to some of those kids. You might be setting up things in their home. And I've certainly had kids that have not been able to come in where even before we had one-to-one, we gave them Skype a couple times a week, and we gave them the computer and we gave them the setup. So I think that's the basic approach.
Great. And Jennifer, questions come in. Is there a sense of and this is a broad question, but perhaps tailored to this specific topic, is there a sense of the liability the schools face when we return to in-person instruction, and raising the likelihood of having staff or students contract COVID, and what are your thoughts on that?
So I think this is where ISB's guidance is critical. If we are complying with the guidance of the state, districts have significant liability protection built into the law. So if we're then complying with what the state, the federal government are advising, you're not going to be found to be reckless. That high burden that has to be met for a district to be liable for putting someone in risk of harm simply will not be met. And so that's where, but what I think is really difficult about that is the guidance in some situations is so hard to follow. If you really get into this guidance and you're really applying, if you're really doing all the safeguards, I mean, I've heard many educators just like, it's not going to happen, or it's not going to happen with fidelity. So that's, I think, the bigger concern. If you can return with what the recommendations are, I don't see a liability concern. If you can't, or you're not following the guidance, I am concerned.
Sure. And pivoting back to some of the stuff that we talked about earlier, Dana, we had a question come in indicating that they actually have a team available to complete assessments for students in our building. Can the district say we won't compensate you for your time?
No. That's the answer. No. You must pay people when they work. So I think the issue is like, are you out of your teacher contracts and your support staff contracts go for a certain amount of days. When you've used all those days, now you're on whatever the contract calls for hourly pay or extra duty pay or whatever you want to call it, or however it's characterized. But no, you have to pay staff when they come in for days that they're not contractually obligated to be there.
So I think this probably, Jen, answers the other question that came in about schools looking to Saturdays in order to offer some sort of rotating student schedules. Have you heard of that, and what are the issues that raises for you?
I mean, I think the biggest thing we've heard is that there is guidance that will be coming and will address things such as scheduling, and I think we're all kind of on the edge of our seat on that. I believe, so as soon as we get that guidance, I think then everyone can kick off in earnest, really planning on those issues. So that's what I would say about Saturdays. We'll wait and see.
Okay, great.
Yeah, and I think that's also, to Dana's point, is just going to be a labor issue as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's a definite labor. And I think we also have to maintain our sense of perspective and not to minimize anything you said, Jackie, about kids needing that contact and kids need to be in this, but they're also kids, and we can't make up for the time missed. You know what I mean? Like, you might say, I was supposed to thought I was going to work 30 hours this week, but next week I'll just work 70 and it's all good. And adults, we can do that, but kids can't do that. That's not healthy for them. So we have to keep that in mind as well.
Yeah. Oh, I think we lost Kendra for a moment there too. So,
and I would just, as far as guidance goes, I did just read from OSA.
Kendra, I think we've got you back if you want to.
I'm back. Okay. I just wanted to flag that I did read that OSAP is likely to have some additional guidance out soon as well. And so I know, you know, the guidance is sort of a double-edged sword. We want to know what to do, but also everybody's got to be moving forward with planning. And so you just kind of have your fingers crossed that the guidance doesn't say something different than what you put in place. But we'll be on the lookout for that as well.
Yeah, that's a great closing. We are just about out of time. I know we have some questions. A lot of them relate to scheduling and how to rotate students in and out of the building. We will definitely be addressing those in an upcoming webinar once we get a little bit more guidance from ISB. There's also some personnel issues, and we are planning to have another labor and employment related webinar coming up in the next couple of weeks, hopefully with some folks, some other guest speakers. So we will keep all of these questions. We'll try to address those in future webinars. We're sorry that we didn't get to everything. Huge thanks to Jackie for coming on and giving us the parent perspective, the advocate perspective, so valuable for our districts to understand what your clients have been facing and what they will face in the fall. We thank all of you for joining us, and we will be back next week with our Superintendent's Roundtable, and we hope that you join us then. Goodbye, everyone.